TrueNorthTV, powered by Communitech. From Waterloo Region, Ontario, Canada, to the world. The conversations you need and want to hear with interesting people who live at the intersection of technology and humanity. Tech for good. Let's get started.
Thanks, Talia, and welcome to True North TV. My name is Ian Klugman, and I'm your host. My guest today has done so much to advance innovation, entrepreneurship, and artificial intelligence in Canada. It's hard to know where to begin when introducing him. For starters, Ajay Agrawal is a leading academic. He's a top-rated professor at the University of Toronto's Rutman School of Management, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a faculty affiliate at the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence in Toronto. Professor Agrawal is also the co-founder of the Creative Destruction Lab, a program to accelerate commercialization of science for the betterment of humankind. CDL operates at 5 Canadian universities and 3 more in the UK, US, and France. He's also the co-founder of the Next 36, Next AI, Next Founders, all not-for-profit programs that support young entrepreneurs, many of them working in the field of machine learning. He also co-founded 2 annual conferences in machine learning as well, and a book. He's co-authored Prediction Machines, the Simple Economics of Artificial Intelligence, which is a bestseller that landed on the Forbes list of top 10 technology books in 2018. Ajay is an advisor to the governments of the United States and Japan, as well as an advisor to Carnegie Mellon University's Block Center for Technology and Society, which is focused on the future of work and the related issues of trust and transparency around autonomous or semi-autonomous systems and the decisions they make. And finally, on top of all of that, he's co-founder of Kindred, building intelligence for robots, and Sanctuary, building synths, which he describes as beautiful machines with superhuman empathy. Ajay, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Ian, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, machine learning, artificial intelligence. For our viewers, can you unpack a bit as to what this is, what's the difference, and why is it so important?
Ian, as you know, my background is economics. I'm an economist. The lens that I look at AI from is through economics. And so the way economists tackle or try and understand any technology, not just AI, is economists reduce every technology down to a single question. And that question is, what does this reduce the cost of? And so in the case of AI, when you ask me what is it, from an economist perspective, it's a thing that reduces the cost of prediction. So it makes prediction cheap. Think of it as quality adjusted prediction cheap. So holding the quality, the accuracy of a prediction constant, it lowers the cost of producing that prediction. And so your second part of your question was, why is it so important? Is because prediction, it turns out, is at the root of many things we do. A lot more things than I think most people originally realized. So most of the time when you ask people, like, what's prediction? Let's say if they're in business, they'll say, well, you know, prediction is like I want to predict what sales will be like in Q3 next year that haven't happened yet. And so the way that we think of prediction is that you take information you have to generate information you don't have. And so in the case of sales, the information I have is the sales I've done in the last, say, 2 years. And the information I don't have is sales in Q3 next year. And that's the thing I want to predict. But all these new applications of predictions have opened up. So for example, driving. Most people never thought of driving as a prediction problem, but that's precisely how we are handling it with AI. Most people didn't think of radiology as a prediction problem, but of course, that's really how we're solving it today in terms of the data we have is the pixels in a medical image, and the data we don't have is the label on the tumor as malignant or benign. Replying to your email, most people never thought of replying to email as a prediction problem, but every time you use let's say a smart email client that gives you the three suggestions at the bottom, when you hit reply, you get the 3 suggestions. That's Google or whoever has read your email and has predicted how you want to reply. So all these things we've recognized at their root are prediction problems. So, so when you say like, why is it so important? It's because this technology has lowered the cost of a function prediction that we've recognized is at the core of many things that we do.
I mean, this is going to be, transformative across, you've identified healthcare, business, driving, the automobile. Is there an area which is not going to be affected by this?
So it feels like there's no industry that is not being affected. In other words, when we started our work in economics of AI, we were focused in some of the areas that have attracted a lot of attention, like driverless cars and advertising, like Facebook and Google type advertising. But since the book came out and we've met with business leaders across market segments, we have yet to find an industry where it's not having a meaningful impact. So, but that doesn't mean every element of every industry. So the way we have started thinking of the world is in terms of predictions and judgments. And the AIs do predictions better than human prediction, but AIs have no judgment. And so we're starting to see a new way of thinking of the division of labor between humans and machines.
There's a lot of people who do talk about, is this going to squeeze out human beings? You've answered it in talking about the difference between prediction and judgment. But there's a whole raft of issues associated with things like data and privacy associated with a lot of the technologies that are emerging right now. Where's the place of the human, and what should we be thinking about as far as issues associated with data and privacy?
I think it's one ultimately we are going to have to answer as a country. In other words, country by country, everyone's going to have to decide on the trade-off that they're willing to make. So there's AI, you can think of it very fundamentally as like pattern recognition, and in order to recognize its patterns, it needs data. And so for AI to do work for you, to personalize things for you, whether it's personalizing your music stream or your shopping or your medicine, it needs to know about you. And so if it doesn't know, if you restrict what it can know about you, then you are ultimately restricting how well it can work on your behalf. At one point, one of my co-authors was testifying before the US Congress on, in the lead up to the November election, a lot of, particularly on the Democrat side, they've been worried about the power of the large tech firms, the FANG companies, and how much data privacy that they are compromising, and are they too big? Are these companies simply too big? But the thing to keep in mind is that Facebook does social, Google does search, Netflix does entertainment, Amazon does retail. Tencent does all of those things in one company.
You seem to be saying that you don't think that FANG is too big. Why do you think there are people in Canada who are so fussed about the Googles and the Facebooks? What is it that scares them?
I'm not sure I would fully commit to saying that the FANGs are not too big. Only that it's important, I think, to have multiple competitors. And what I wouldn't advocate for is a setting where ultimately a Tencent or an Alibaba, because they are so much larger and they can make so much better predictions, that they leave the other companies in the dust. The essence of machine intelligence that makes it different from other software is that it learns. So, the software that you and I grew up with, when it ships and people start using it on day one, and then they're using it a year later, it still operates exactly the same a year later as it did the day that, when you and I first started. So we would take off the shrink wrap and install the software. And so it would work the same way a year later as it did the day that we started using it. Whereas with machine intelligence, the more people use it, the better it gets at making predictions for that person. And so What's interesting about it is that the better it gets at making predictions, the more people want to use it. The more people want to use it, the more data it generates, and the more data it generates, the better the predictions get. So the flywheel starts to turn. That means you get a big advantage for whoever gets their flywheel starting to turn first, because unlike in the kind of traditional bricks and mortar economy, you can have let's say for something like coffee, you can have high quality and medium quality and low quality coffee all coexisting at the same time in the market. And the reason's because they can differentiate on price. So if you want to pay for the really fancy, organic coffee, you can do that and you'll pay extra. And if you're happy to have, a more run-of-the-mill coffee, you can pay a lower price and have that. But in predictions, the cost is the same whether you're producing a really high quality prediction or a mediocre quality prediction. At the margin, so that the cost of producing one more prediction is no greater if you're using a very well-trained model or a less well-trained model. So that means that the economics become such that it really can favor AIs that get a head start. Because once they get better than their peer group, then everyone's saying, why am I using the second best AI? I'll use the best AI because it costs the same. Every time someone does a Google search, they type in their thing into the query box, and then they hit enter, and Google has no understanding of what you've sent. They just receive a character string, and then they make a prediction, and then they serve up, let's say, a list of 10 links. And then every time you click the link, let's say you click link number 3, Google says, oops, we made a mistake. We thought that was your third best option, but you just told us it's your first best because you clicked it first. And so it updates its model, it learns. So there's billions of us working for Google every day every time we do a Google search and then we click the link that it serves up, the one we want the most, we're training the model.
So the barriers to entry, unlike when Porter gave us his model that we all lived with through our MBAs and such, the barriers to entry now are data.
Ian, you're hitting some buttons with me when you reference Mike Porter and his 5 forces. Right. So that was all about trying to figure out who has market power. And here, very often market power comes from data. It often comes down to having who's got the best data. And so that very often becomes a competitive advantage. So, but it's not just the training data. It's also when you train the data to get the model up to a certain performance level, and then you put the model out into the field. And then if you're still collecting data out in the field, that becomes data as well. And so sometimes, like for example, in your world and my world, where we're dealing with startups, they get their hands on some initial data. They do an initial training of the model. Then they bring their model and they sell it to, let's say, an enterprise. And the question becomes, once the enterprise deploys the model and then generates an output, who gets that data? Because that's like gold dust. That's the data that allows the model to keep learning and updating. And so many of the startups that you and I deal with out of Waterloo and Toronto and various places across the country, they are in the middle of these negotiations right now with the enterprises that they're trying to sell their products to, of who gets the data, which is the output from their initial models.
Lots of talk at the federal level. Navdeep Bains, about 1.5 years ago, put out the principles associated with data, the 10 principles that would undergird the approach that the government of Canada would take. Do you have a point of view as to, are they coming at this the right way? What should they be focusing on? And how do we build, back to where we started, how do we build a framework, a data framework that is truly Canadian and appropriate for us?
So I think it's a great question. It may turn out to be the question, of the decade, because every country is picking its approach. And, Europe has chosen their approach, which has, I think, benefited them in some ways and really harmed them in others. And of course, China's got an approach, and our approach is, I would still say is still nascent. Like, we're still sort of very much finding our way, and it's not clear that having a a one size fits all is necessarily going to be the right way to go. That we may treat health information very different than, for example, financial information. And so, it, it seems to me that overall we should enable a fair amount of individual level choice with how much data that we're willing to give up, and figure out which types of data are opt-in versus opt-out.
Is there an opportunity for Canada? I mean, our premise is that because of the trust associated with our brand, and what we've learned about global supply chains in the last 6 months, there's a real opportunity for Canada to be a leader, not just in producing what we need, but also to be producing what the world needs, and to play a role as the country which does set the standards, as opposed to just adhering to them being set by either Europe, China, or America.
Yes. So in my view right now, the number one element in the process of setting standards is to make the trades explicit. And so, and then once the trades are explicit, then we can, as a society or as our either municipal or provincial or federal representatives, decide which trades they're going to make, depending on how the information is governed. So, for example, I think that what everybody has just lived through with COVID-19 has forced us to come to grips with the trades that we're willing to make and not make with regards to public health. So, it seemed to me like there was a majority view in April that when this was first, we were kind of in our first month or so in COVID-19, that people had very strong views regarding the risks they were willing to take, for example, sending their children to school. And then over the next 4 or 5 months, people's views started to change, partly because they got new information. They learned more about how the disease is spread, partly because they got new information of what it's like to have your children home for 4 or 5 months. That I think we started becoming much more explicit about the trade-off of what were we willing to take, as opposed to we want to avoid any risk at all cost. I think what we've learned in the last 6 months is that's just not feasible. And so we're going to be taking some risks, and now we have to figure out what trades we're willing to make. And for example, are schools more important than restaurants and bars? If we have to close one, and not the other, how do we think about that trade?
I'm not sure you've been following the work of Dr. Michael Mina, a professor at Harvard University. He's been sort of our North Star as we've tried to figure out how do we understand this thing and what do we need to be doing as a society. And currently what he's helped us understand is that we actually need to be testing for people who are COVID contagious as opposed to COVID positive, because we know that it's the super spreaders earlier on in this virus that are the ones who A, are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, and B, the ones who got these massive viral loads, which are creating this issue for us. And if we can get to a test, an antigen test, home administered, this could all absolutely change. All that said, I want to talk about Christmas greetings. So where did that come from? For those of you who haven't had the fortune of seeing some of these Christmas greetings, but where did that come from? Where did that start? And how has that become important to you in your life?
That was a real right turn there. Let me first do a couple of things on Michael Mina, and then I'll go to the Christmas greetings.
Sure.
So, Michael Mina's insights was a really important one, focusing on infectiousness rather than infection, and the difference between, I think many people still don't recognize the importance of that insight, which is that from a medical diagnostics point of view, what matters is, are you infected? But from a public health and reopening up the world economy perspective, we care much less about whether an individual is infected, but whether they're infectious, because that determines whether they will spread it. And what's important about that is that when you're infectious, you have a much higher viral load than if you're, then in other words, you can be infected, but with a very low viral load that is so low that you won't be infectious. Now, why does that matter? It matters because of the technology for testing. Is that testing technology, like the gold standard, the PCR tests, are super, super sensitive. They can detect very low trace levels of viral RNA, but they're really slow and really expensive. Like they take hours and you got to go to the lab and so on. Whereas the antigen tests that you referenced can be really cheap and really fast. In other words, we could probably start testing everybody every day because there are a couple, but you can potentially get them down to a couple bucks a test. And they don't have to be like the brain ticklers, it can be like spit on a stick kind of test. And so, and the thing about the antigen tests is they are not accurate enough to detect low level infection, but they are accurate enough to detect infectiousness. And that's why that distinction is so important. And just to kind of bring everything back to AI, these tests are effectively predictions. Like they've got false positives, false negatives. So they're not an extreme, like they're not as kind of a determining with certainty. They're determining with a probability that you're infectious or you're not infectious. And so I'm imagining that 6 to 12 months from now, we will have an elaborate system with very frequent, rapid, spit on a stick kind of testing, and AIs that are digesting all this information and making predictions based on an antigen test, potentially, a thermal test, maybe some other test, and maybe we're being tested in real time, like we're doing antigen tests, and then every time you pick up your phone, it's taking a test using sensors or your watch or whatever. Anyhow, so I think that Michael Mina insight's really important, and it will be a key piece of which AI will also play a part in helping us reopen the economy. Christmas. So the Christmas videos were a thing we did with our family when YouTube was just becoming a thing. We thought it'd be fun to try out YouTube, and so we did it by making a Christmas video and sending it around to friends. And then it's one of those things where we did it the first year, and a lot of people, our friends, liked it. So we said, well, we'll do it again. And then we've just kept doing it ever since.
So, Ajay, you just spent, not just, but a couple of years ago, you spent a year sabbatical at Stanford. You're associated with Carnegie Mellon. You're intimately involved with the Vector Institute. There's a lot of hype about how well we're doing as far as our capabilities as a nation. How are we doing in your opinion, relative to sort of other major locations?
I think we are holding our own on the research side, and we are mediocre in the actual commercial application side. I think it's because the leaders on the application side were people that were quick to recognize the value of predictions in their setting. And those were largely companies that were already fully digital. So, when I go and meet with a CEO now and they say, hey, we need an AI strategy, where should we start? My answer to them is usually, well, let's go to the data science group in your company and find out what predictions they're doing. And whatever they're doing, those are ones where we can probably start with AI, because AI will likely be able to do them better, faster, cheaper. And so for example, if I'm at a bank, it will be fraud detection, anti-money laundering, sanction screening, know your customer, like that kind of stuff, where they're already doing predictive analytics on that, and now they can introduce AI. In the case of machine learning, the people that were early to recognize the value of prediction were generally organizations that were kind of pushing the frontier of prediction already. And so when this thing came along, they said, hey, this is another technique for doing prediction. And so they were, it was like almost native to them, and everything was already in a digital format. So also when I'm meeting with these companies, the reason I say start wherever your data science team is already doing predictions is because they've already figured out where the predictions work in their workflow. They've already digitized all the information required to make those predictions because they're using some kind of other software analytical tool, and the method of putting the predictions into the workflow has been established. Whereas when you're coming into an organization that isn't used to putting predictions into the workflow, they sometimes have to start right from the basics of just digitizing the information they need first. And then once they digitize the information and they generate the prediction, they have to say, okay, now what do I do with the prediction? Because the prediction is worth zero if it doesn't influence an action. And so that's often, it's a really important part of the process is the change management involved in how do we change the workflow now that we've got this new prediction that's going to change the action. And so, with our startups, we had a whole bunch of startups that were, they had founders that were recently graduated PhDs, and they were really smart in terms of on the computer science side. And they would build these incredible prediction machines, and then they would go to sell them, and they would hit a wall, and the enterprise went by them. And so eventually, I ended up going and having a series of meetings with the people at McKinsey, because I was trying to understand on the enterprise side, how do we, penetrate that wall? And the answer I ended up coming up with was, this is not just, people think of AI as a technology problem. I've come to view it as it's really a change management problem. It's a change management problem, which is why, companies like McKinsey and their competitors are, in some sense, much better positioned than a lot of people might think with regards to AI, because they are experts at change management, which is at the end of the day, if you are, let's say, putting machine intelligence into a car, let's say, assembly plant, or a parts manufacturer, or an insurance company, or a bank, or a retailer, like anywhere where you all of a sudden making much more use of prediction than you did before because you're introducing AI, will require a bunch of change management.
Speaking of predictions, what's going to happen in the US election?
Oh boy. For anyone who's watching this, today is Monday, October, what is it today? October 5 or 6 or something? And so 5, thank you. If I would have taken the bait and answered this question of yours, Ian, a week ago, you think how much has happened in the last week. So I am going to not take the bait and not offer any answer on this one. Too hard to predict. By the way, neither could an AI. Okay, because AIs need enough events to train on. And so often people say, like, and I think you said in one of your opening questions today, like basically, can AIs just do everything? And the answer is, AIs are really restricted to the types of things where they can get enough examples to train on to be able to make the predictions. And they need a lot of examples. And so for something like a US federal election where we only get one outcome every 4 years, there's so much happening between elections, it's just impossible for an AI to really make any significant progress on prediction.
So we're going to have to count on the American people's judgment then, as opposed to being able to predict the outcome. And certainly we do hope for a certain outcome. The other piece in all of this is you personally. What have you? How has the past 6.5, 7 months changed you? Are you thinking about different things? Are you working on different things? Have different things become priorities that weren't priorities before? I mean, what has COVID done to Dr. Ajay Agrawal?
I've just started a reading group that starts tomorrow night with my students and some people from the Creative Destruction Lab community. And the title of the reading group is called on being human. And effectively, the purpose of the reading group is to take all the advances that are happening in technology. The first night's readings are all about what's going on at Neuralink. And then we go through, and then it's some science, some computer science on AI and robotics, and some literature, like we're going to read Frankenstein, and we're going to read Machines Like Me. And I would say at a deep level, the thing that COVID has done to me personally is to really recalibrate, what's important to me, and in some sense what it means to be human. Because when you're used to dealing with people, and all of a sudden everything's on a Zoom screen in 2 dimensions, and so that there's that Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And it feels a little bit like, wow, when everything gets stripped away, then it's like the water receding, like when the tide goes out, and you see sort of what's there. And I feel like a lot of that's happened. And at least for me, that's been led to a fair amount of soul searching.
Ajay, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you so much for joining me today on True North TV. It was great to have you. And I wanted to thank all of you at home who tuned in for True North TV, and hope to see you next lunchtime, Tuesday at noon, for the next episode.
Thanks for watching this episode of True North TV. Missed an episode? Watch them on demand at TrueNorthWaterloo.com or on Communitech's YouTube channel.